Let's get started. We've got a great session. I'm very happy to be chairing here on ensuring a fair distribution of environmental taxes and spending. Got some really interesting papers. Very international panel representing Mexico twice, South Africa, and UK. I guess Miguel's representing both Mexico and UK. And Michael DANQUAH will be joining us from, who's from Ghana, from UNU-WIDER. So let's just jump right in. First paper is by John Scott from CIDE in Mexico.
Well, they put the presentation. Thanks. I'm going to present a paper on the effect of taxes, on environmental taxes on redistribution. And basically, as you know, there's a potential conflict between environmental goals and distributive goals in terms of taxation, because of course, most energy taxes are on fuel and carbon associated with fuel, and that is a progressive element, which is the consumption of private gasoline, but a regressive element, which is all the indirect effects, so public transportation and transportation of goods. So I'm going to talk about that in the case of Mexico. Exactly. So let me, in terms of motivation, the reason why I think it's very interesting is because in Mexico, we have had an interesting natural experiment, which is a shift over the last 10 years from very large petrol subsidies to very large petrol taxes. A shift which is basically 2 point something, almost 3 points of GDP on the burden of households. And it's interesting to see what effect that had on the distribution of the fiscal system in Mexico. To do that, I'm going to also make a simulation, which is instead of imputing the benefits of the subsidy or of the tax resources to the current structure of social spending in Mexico, I will simulate a universal transfer and show basically that even though the first order effect of the subsidy of the tax is regressive, once you consider spending, it is actually a very powerful redistributive mechanism. No? And that's something which happens in high-income countries like Mexico or South Africa, because even a non-targeted transfer, a universal transfer, has a potentially very important distributive effect simply because of the distribution of income. No? So, of course, energy taxes are one of the main policy instruments used to reduce greenhouse gases in the world. In the case of Mexico, I already mentioned this change in policy. Very recently, last year, the tax shifted again, became a subsidy as part of an anti-inflationary policy. Petrol taxes are also very efficient fiscal instrument because even though in the long term they promote environmental effects, in the short term they have the elasticity of demand is very low, so they distort the economy in the short run very little. Low evasion, they're easy to raise, especially in the case of Mexico because the petrol company is a national company, and low administrative cost. No? So again, we are going to emphasize indirect effects as well as direct using an input-output matrix for the Mexican economy. And we're going to see the net redistributive effect in the context of the whole fiscal system in Mexico. So all taxes and all spending that you can actually estimate. We're using a national income survey, the Encuesta Nacional de Ingreso y Gasto de los Hogares, which is the main survey used to analyze any distributive analysis in Mexico. No? And the main result that we're going to see is that with the current spending structure in Mexico, the tax actually, the fiscal system as a whole is impoverishing. So what the poor pay in taxes is more than what they obtain in transfers. And that's a result, in part, of the increase in this tax, and secondly, of the fact that Mexico, unlike, for example, South Africa, has a very low budget allocated to direct cash transfers to households. So my main argument will not be to say that it's not a good idea to have environmental taxes, but they have to be used to finance compensatory transfers, which in the case of Mexico, we don't have, no? Well, let me jump over this. This just shows that Mexico is actually one of the largest producers of gases in Latin America, but also when the tax is a tax, it's an important tax in relative terms. This compares South Africa, for example, in terms of the net energy tax revenue. You cannot see the countries, but you can see where Mexico is and South Africa, and Mexico is in the middle, a bit below, South Africa at the top in terms of how much revenue is raised from taxes. Energy taxes, mainly petrol fuel taxes. No? In the case of South Africa, it's about 3%, Mexico more like 1%. But that changes a lot in time. As you see here, in the blue lines are the tax and subsidy for gasolines, which at some point it becomes a subsidy in between 2004 and 2014. Recently it has been a tax, as in the past, but that estimate of the OECD is from 2021, where it was a tax, but it changes over time. No? So as I said, last year it was a subsidy. This year, again, it's become a tax. No? The net effective carbon rates in Mexico are generated, as in many other countries, a lot is generated by transportation, where the tax is concentrated, but a lot in other areas like industry and other sources, where really there's very little taxation. No? But that's common in many countries. So this is the main type of analysis that I do. These are income deciles. No, the one is the poorest 10% of the population, 10 the richest, and what you see is the direct and indirect effect of the tax in terms of its effect on market income, households' market income. No? And as you can see, the direct effect is progressive. No, it has a larger effect on richer households, but the total effect, which is a gray line, which is adding to the direct effect, the indirect effect, makes the tax actually regressive. Here we see the change in time. No? In 2014, this was a subsidy, and it was a progressive subsidy. But then in 2018, and more so in 2020, it has become, as we just saw, a regressive tax. Once you see the combined, here we have all the indirect taxes in Mexico, plus the domestic electricity subsidy, which is a subsidy. And then in the green line, we add all other taxes, with all direct taxes. So as you can see, Mexico's fiscal system is fairly flat. No, it becomes progressive through the direct taxes, but not very much. No, it goes from 15 to 20%. And once you consider transfers, one thing which is very important in Mexico basically is that we have a dual system of social protection. On the one hand, the formal workers are protected through contributory social security systems, while the uninsured, which in Mexico, in contrast to South Africa, is very large, like half of the workers, they receive non-contributive programs, which are ad hoc, but recently have grown a lot. This line you have in black shows that increase, which is a universal non-contributive pension that Mexico has. Unfortunately, this growth, recent growth in the current government, recent growth in transfers, has been at the cost of the progressivity or the targeting of transfers. No, they have increase the transfers, but they change the instruments that they use. So now we have more transfers, but actually the net effect on the poor is the same or negative, because as you can see in 2018, 24% of those transfers reached the poor, the extreme poor, the first decile, and that became much flatter last year. On the right hand, you can see that the distribution of contributory pensions is extremely regressive. It concentrates because of the distribution of informality and formality. So the overall effect, combining these two types of pension systems, is concentrated on the top more than, this is in absolute terms, no? When you see it in terms of, in relative terms, relative to market income, of course, it's very flat from the fourth decile onwards, but because the income in the first decile is so low, it's actually progressive in relative terms. So it's redistributive for that decile. But what this shows is that basically after the second decile, the tax system becomes a net tax for the lowest, for the third and upper deciles. No? And what we're going to show is we're going to compare 4 types of income concepts. One is tax after direct transfers, which is the net market income, which, as you can see here, this is the Gini coefficient, the change in the Gini coefficient compared to market income. So the Gini coefficient goes down a bit, 1.45%. Gross income is after transfers, and disposable income, as you know, is after both taxes, direct taxes, and transfers. And finally, the concept which is less usually used, but very important, is consumable income, which is disposable income after adding to that indirect taxes and indirect subsidies. So consumption taxes, no? VAT, gasoline tax. And you see that in the case of inequality, basically, it doesn't change a lot, but when we see it in terms of poverty, if you see the left-hand side on extreme poverty, basically what you see is that the tax system lost distributive power. It didn't have a lot, no? These are percentage points of the extreme poverty line in Mexico, which is like 20%, so not a lot, but still. But that effect has disappeared with time. If you see the yellow line, it becomes smaller in 2018, and then it becomes an actual increase in poverty. So by 2020, because of the gasoline tax, the whole system became impoverishing in terms of money. No? Of course, this doesn't take into account spending on social service, on in-kind transfers like education, health, but the effect in terms of money is now impoverishing. In the case of total poverty, which includes moderate poverty, this has happened already, but the effect has increased over time. No? Just to contrast this, for example, with South Africa, this by the way, is generated. You can find data of this kind in this basis commitment to Equality Institute, which generates comparable standardized benefit incidence analysis of this type. And for South Africa, you can see that in contrast to Mexico, when you compare market income with disposable income, in the extreme food poverty line, there is a huge effect because South Africa has much more generous transfers, direct transfers for the population, and apparently they are fairly well targeted. When you go to higher poverty lines, that effect is less. And actually, when you go to the highest, to the 5.5 PPP 2011 poverty line, the effect, again, the whole system becomes slightly impoverishing, basically neutral. No? Finally, what I did to illustrate, despite these results, the environmental tax, the gasoline tax, has a large distributive potential, is to assume that all the tax revenue of the petrol taxes is used not in a targeted transfer, but in a universal transfer. That would, because Mexico has a very low transfer rate, that would have a huge effect. And as you can see, instead of increasing poverty in terms of consumer income, it would actually decrease by 4 points. Total poverty, instead of increasing 5 points, it would increase much less. And the Gini coefficient, again, instead of being 3 points lower, it would be almost 5 points lower. No? So that's where the potential is. No? And the main lesson, the main conclusion I would draw from this study is that the reason why you can avoid the conflict between distribution and environmental goals in terms of the fiscal system is because environmental taxes, in addition to being obviously an effective instrument in environmental terms, they are also a very good tax, a very good way to generate revenue. And in high-income countries especially, the optimal way to reduce poverty and inequality through the fiscal system is not to have a very progressive tax system, is to have a very productive tax system, which then you can use to finance transfers. Of course, if you have a very progressive one and a less progressive, and they are equally productive, it's better the more progressive one, but that doesn't happen generally, no? So the optimal tax system tends to be not particularly progressive for many reasons, no? Which has been analyzed in the optimal tax literature, but also for obvious administrative reasons, etc. The more productive, the more impact you can have through transfers, no? But it's very important to have those transfers. Again, in Mexico, they are growing very recently, but most of the revenue of this gasoline tax was used actually to compensate the loss of oil revenues that the Mexican government received, and was spent in subsidies to the contributive system, which, as we saw, is not very progressive, and to other spending categories. No? So I leave it at that. I don't know how much. Excellent. Thank you.
Very good. All right, very interesting. Next presentation is by Vusi GUMEDE from University of Mpumalanga in South Africa. Vusi.
Thanks, David. Let's see our presentation. We're a team of 3. I'm the only one that's here, and others are joining online. I hope they're able to join. So we'll co-present particularly with Mduduzi Biyase. Just a bit of background. So we've been trying to do some work around the just transition. Now that I'm based in Mpumalanga in particular, one of the most said to be the most affected, would be the most affected province by the just transition if we don't handle it well, because of the many coal-fired power stations. So we've been working with the provincial government and others, including the World Bank, Développement Public Enterprises, doing some various studies that are trying to assist that the province can handle the just transition better, and that work is ongoing. And there are many similar initiatives in the province. These are just some of those that I've been involved with. But for this paper, we're specifically looking at inequality. We're invited to focus on inequality, and we're hoping to do a much more comprehensive analysis of income inequality and environmental degradation in South Africa, and that's what we're going to present. The paper itself is supposed to look at implications for the labor market or the project as a whole, look at implications for economic and social policies, and it's ongoing. So hopefully this paper will be ready soon. We're hoping that we should be able to finish in a week or so. One issue that comes up in what we've done so far is that how the government, and the provincial government in this case, which is what we've been looking at, the various systems, processes, structures that are there, as well as capacity, matter a lot in how you can handle just transition. And we've made proposals based on what we're asked to do for them. And I'm just making this point that it's really critical that we do look at the institutional architecture, particularly at the provincial level. But of course, there must be interface between provincial, local, and national, particularly for those provinces that will be significantly affected, such as the province of Mpumalanga. And as indicated here, we're focusing on mainly inequality and CO2 emissions. And we have looked at this literature. These are recent studies that we looked at from different countries, using different methodologies, and we've used some of these methodologies for our own paper. Interestingly, John was talking about different income, types of income. This paper on France actually finds that the relationship between income inequality and CO2 emissions depend on the measure of income that you use. So it confirms to some extent what you've been talking about. We've looked at Turkey, which is a similar finding that we find in the context of South Africa. Indonesia, interestingly, is a different result. And you have studies that have looked at financial stability or instability and the institutions, and I think that's very critical. For instance, this last study by you and others for 2019 that looked at the institutions, and indeed that point institutions can worsen in the impact of inequality on CO2 emissions. Maybe another interesting result to highlight here would be for developing countries. Study looked at G20 countries, income inequality had increases CO2 emissions. For most developed countries, of course, it's different from what we find, and we'll talk a bit about that. So I'm not sure if Mduduzi has joined. He's going to cover this section. He's currently in Kenya, and he
yes, I have joined. Can you hear me?
Okay, please go ahead, Mdu.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm having some difficulties in terms of the internet connectivity here. So I am actually currently, hotspotting. So let me know if you're not able to hear me clearly, and I'll see what I can do. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into the methodology section. But as Prof. GUMEDE correctly pointed out, a number of studies have attempted, to investigate the relationship between income inequality and CO2 emissions in both developed and developing countries. And then the key studies are by Boyce and Ravalion. However, the relationship between income inequality and CO2 emission is still very much inconclusive. Importantly, the relationship between income inequality and CO2 emissions has been largely ignored in developing countries, particularly South Africa. Therefore, this study will attempt, to sort of analyze the impact of income inequality on CO2 emissions and whether or not the effect of inequality on CO2 emissions depends on GDP. Now, in terms of the empirical framework, our paper follows other important scholars in this field, but we also make suitable modifications to capture the particular features of South Africa. So to estimate the effect of inequality on CO2 emissions, what you do is we add urbanization, which is obviously quite important for South Africa. We also add agriculture, manufacture, and services value added as they appear to be relevant for environmental degradation analysis. So the relationship is specified as shown. Sorry, can you go back to the other equation?
We're going to run out of time because I think we're going to run out of time. Let's try. We have 15 minutes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm going to go to this equation here. And what this equation is really kind of showing is on the left-hand side, we have the CO2 emissions, which is our dependent variable. And then on the right-hand side, just to simplify this, we have variables with the summation mark, and those captures the short-run effects of independent variables on the CO2 emissions. And the ones without the summation symbols captures the long-run effects of our variables on the CO2 emissions. Can we move on to the next slide then? Okay, so once we have established if there's a long-run relationship between the variables using the appropriate statistical tools, we then proceed to estimate the short-run relationship as shown by this equation here. And as you can see, this equation is fairly similar to equation 2. The top part of equation 2, the only difference is the last variable denoted by ECM, and that variable basically captures the speed of adjustment to equilibrium. Next slide, please. So figure 3 shows the scatter plot for the association between CO2 emissions and income inequality. And what we found is that the CO2 and income inequality are positively related in South Africa. And although we don't display it in the presentation, we also conducted the Phillips-Perron test to ascertain the order of variables. And this was done to ensure that none of the variables were integrated of order 2. Our analysis revealed that the variables are integrated of both order 0 and order 1. And as a result, we employed the autoregressive distributed lag model in this study. Right. In terms of the results, the empirical evidence of the short run and the long run are actually presented in this table. And I'm just going to focus on the key results here. It shows that the estimated coefficient of income inequality has a positive and a statistical significant effect on CO2 emissions. The long run result shows that higher levels of environmental degradation is associated with higher income inequality in South Africa. And the number of scholars have also verified the positive relationship between these variables. And a plausible explanation for this particular relationship is that as poverty deepens, the higher rate of poverty compels the poor to degrade the environment in order to survive. Now, the coefficient of the income variables is also statistically significant and positive, while the coefficient of the squared income is statistically significant and negative. A finding demonstrating that the economic development and CO2 emissions maintains a nonlinear relationship. This result confirms the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis, illustrating the inverted U-shaped relationship between variables. I think you're moving very fast. I'm going to skip the result of control variables.
Sorry.
But maybe let me just mention them, in passing. In terms of the result of the control variables, we find that urbanization increases the CO2 emissions, and this could be attributed to low energy efficiency, low levels of energy saving technology, and an absence of environmental awareness. Just quickly, in terms of the other control variables, an increase in agricultural value add was also found to reduce emissions, whereas the coefficient of the manufacturing value add has a significant positive effect on CO2 emissions, and this is expected and consistent with the literature. The result confirmed that industrialization is associated with higher emissions. Finally, the estimated coefficient of the service value add has a significantly negative effect on CO2 emissions, and this confirms tertiarization effect hypothesis And according to this hypothesis, a high share of services in GDP is negatively associated with CO2 emissions. And this may be because the service sector is generally less energy intensive than are the primary and the secondary sector, which are both based on the physical production of goods and services. All right, I'm just going to skip the other part and go straight to the robustness analysis. In terms of the robustness analysis, we try to ensure that the ARD estimated results are robust. We applied the fully modified OLS and dynamic OLS methods. And the main advantage of the dynamic OLS method and fully modified OLS is that it solves the problem of endogeneity problem and a small sample bias, but it can be also employed irrespective of whether the underlying regressors are integrated of order 0 or order 1. So the result obtained from these two estimators presented in the last two tables, interestingly enough, are consistent with the RD estimates. I'm going to stop there. I see my co-author is rushing me because of time constraint. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Prof. Mdu. Now, we had to try and cut down because the presentation was quite long, and so we can have also a discussion, we have a discussant as well. So I think, Mdu has made these points. It's not surprising because many studies find the same, or for the context of a developing country, the association of higher inequality and CO2 emissions. And the point that the results also make that it appears that in the context of South Africa, there is indeed an environmental cost curve. There are, of course, debates about this measure, but we do find evidence that in the context of South Africa, this curve obtains. And essentially is that at the early stages of economic development, there's environmental degradation, and then over time, people take better care of the environment. Of course, there's debate around that, and we've not yet tested whether at what point of the curve South Africa is at, but there's evidence that we are indeed having an environmental cost curve. That said, South African, that's consensus here in the conference that we must address inequalities and environmental degradation, and there are different proposals about how this could be done. And with regards to just energy transition, the point we make is that indeed it should be encouraged, however, that it should be guided by the context and whatever that obtains in a particular nation. And here we think more so about the Mpumalanga province, that indeed what's being planned, if you look at the timeline for the decommissioning of various coal-fired power stations, that there's a lot of more work that still needs to be done, that should have been done, and that context is critical because many people as livelihoods depend on those areas. We make a point here that the people must be involved, and I think many people have made this point. I've jumped a bit. I'm going to the point number 6. And this is particularly important because my sense that the people who are in these affected areas, the areas that will be affected, or communities that will be affected by the just transition, possibly negatively, will have ideas, suggestions about what could be done. So we talk a lot about upskilling, reskilling, and maybe that's not really what would matter for them. Maybe that's important generally for the country as a whole, but maybe not for all communities. It may very well be that maybe they will argue for their children to get schooling, because, of course, when the mine closes, livelihoods are compromised, and may very well be that some of these will have to be relocated and get access to schooling, and healthcare facilities and such. And we think that it's important that communities are directly, substantively involved in the kind of the consultations that we hear about. And the parting shot, I really hear the influence of Thandeka Mkandawire, that part of the challenge we face here in South Africa is that we don't really have a comprehensive social policy. So we talk of social protection, social insurance, and grants, but it's not all very well connected, to the healthcare, education, and other aspects. And this is a point that we're emphasizing. I've been emphasizing and writing about this, trying to clarify that, what we are really talking about when we say we need a comprehensive social policy. And I think it's going to be even more important in the context of the just energy transition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vusi. Next paper is by Miguel Nino ZARAZUA from SOAS in the UK. Aid and Social Protection.
Right, okay. Well, while the slides are ready, thank you very much for the invitation to this session. So the topic I want to talk about is the contribution of foreign aid on the rights of social protection, and the reason and the connection to issues of environment and also climate change relates to, Thanks. So it's because social protection has become a very important policy tool to counteract the effects of climate change impacts. So there is an increasing incidence of environmental shocks, and well, social protection has become an important tool to respond to those shocks. So as you see in this graph, there been a substantial increase in the number of programs that target the specific populations. So you see, for example, in the yellow bar, these are conditional cash transfers that are dominant in Latin America and some parts of the world. But also you find a substantial increase in pure cash transfers, which are these programs that give income support to households in different levels of vulnerability without conditions attached to them. Certainly, social pensions are very important elements in South Africa, for example, in Southern Africa in particular. They have played a very important role in mitigating, for example, the impact of the HIV, during the 1990s. It became an important response by the government to address, the level of vulnerabilities in certain populations. And public works also are an important responses in certain contexts in which unskilled labor supply are matched with this with the demand of infrastructure, so these programs become relevant in this respect. So, which is interesting is that there has been a very rapid increase in this kind of programs, So, and despite the fact that there is an increase, you can see also a very significant level of inequalities within vulnerable populations in terms of coverage across different regions of the world. So to sum up, in sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that while, for example, people in older age, about 30% of the population are covered by social pensions in the region, just about 5% of mothers and newborns are actually benefiting from social protection in the region. So there is a substantial levels of inequality within populations and also across different type of policies. So essentially what we are trying to do in this paper is to get a better picture about the contribution of development agencies, and the reason is because they've been very active, in particular in Africa, in supporting these institutions, the emergence of these systems. We want to understand under what conditions those interventions have worked and why, and whether there are elements in the social context that these countries face, whether there are some limitations and also some elements that may contribute to the expansion of these systems. So our approach is a political economy approach. So we are asking questions that intersect between economic issues and also political ones. No? And the reason in part is because when you look at this comparative perspective in looking at these dynamics, the literature is actually very, very thin. No? Thin in terms of the coverage of the questions and also thin in terms of the methodologies and also the ability to capture some of these dynamics. And the reason is because, well, data is very limited in these areas. We are looking at global trends. And overall, I think that there is, from the existing evidence, there is some interesting insights, certainly in terms of the type of actors involved in the provision of support to those programs. You have bilaterals and multilaterals, but also within different actors, there are certain elements that can play a quite important role in the expansion of those systems. And we also want to understand this in our analysis. So certainly the interaction with, for example, the World Bank, which has been a very important institution in Africa in particular, we want to understand how those channels impact the expansion. And obviously the level of the way those supports is, or the type of finance that are adopted, and also the kind of conditionalities that are often related to those trends can play an important role in this expansion. But also there are other important actors like the ILO, UNICEF, the European Union, the World Food Programme. These are institutions that have been active in the region. And also we are summing up in Africa, but also we look at Latin America and Asia. So, well, I will skip this. So what we are trying to do in a separate paper that links to this one is that we are trying to identify, based on the evidence, what are the determinants, based on the existing work that has been done in this area, that have underpinned the expansion of those systems. And we came up with a very imperfect kind of typology, So that summarizes the kind of factors that can play a role. The first one is there are issues about historical legacies and path dependence clearly in certain contexts that play a role. So these are about the institutions, about the way sometimes certain things continue to influence current policies. This morning we were talking about informality in South Africa. It was very interesting to hear about the historical legacies of institutions have played a role still in the informal economy. So, and obviously there are other factors, the role of institutions, the judiciary system, economic and demographic factors, the role of ideas. There are certain actors that are very active in promoting certain ideas at the global scale, and coverage shocks, which is related to this session, which is coverage shocks include financial crises, which were key in expanding programs in Latin America. In Latin America, we went through a really bad time in the 1990s. So, and those shocks somehow created the political and economic conditions to push forward certain policy responses. And also in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, I think weather shocks have been important in certain contexts as well. So I want to skip this, but essentially this is a kind of simplification of what we are finding in terms of the determinants of the expansion of social protection in terms of different, how can I get rid of the teams so you can see, well. These are organized around certain theories or economic theories that can explain the role of agency, institutions, and structural factors. So we are trying to organize those determinants by different predictors, by dominant theories in economics and in political science as well. But anyway, so going back to the point in which how we want to measure this. So we are using, can we get rid of the teams? Because I cannot see, so the colleagues can see. Thank you. They are controlling thank you. So in order to measure aid to social protection, we identified, we came up with two definitions. The narrow definition covers 7 specific activities that cover these sectors that are supported by donors, bilaterals and multilaterals. We also take a broader definition that also consider employment creation, specific programs that relate to HIV, AIDS, but also related to social protection in particular, labor rights and social dialogue, which in certain contexts have been important. So we have 2 definitions of social protection aid, and we use these definitions in our empirical strategy. Okay. Right. So before I go to the empirics, I just want to show you the distribution of aid by different type of donors and the percentage of the contribution of aid to social protection in this respect. And one of the things that is interesting is that overall, aid to social protection has been around 2% over the last decades. And you can see here, depending on the definition that you adopt, but one of the interesting things is in the relative terms, which means the amount of money going to social protection vis-a-vis the overall distribution to other sectors has been declining. It is in relative terms, despite the fact that the volume of support has been increasing. So there are more support to the overall development agenda, but social protection is kind of losing space in those kind of policy decisions. So it is interesting that, for example, if you look at the type of also donors, multilaterals play, they are important channels for the allocation of international assistance. And this is very interesting when you graphic this. So if you look at global aid to social protection, you will see that multilaterals have been dominant in terms of the flows for social protection, whereas if you look at the overall global development architecture, it's actually bilaterals who are much more active in relation to multilaterals. So social protection aid has this particular characteristic that has been dominant in terms of the allocation by multilaterals. And obviously, multilaterals are just channels because bilateral support the World Bank, for example, the ILO. No? And also in terms of understanding how these channels work, it's also important to look at the type of instruments that donors use. If you look at the left-hand side, you can see that debt instruments dominate global multilateral aid vis-a-vis grants that are dominant among bilaterals. And there are technical reasons for that. And also, in terms of the absorptive capacity, you can see that, for example, Latin America played a very substantial role in absorbing those resources during the crisis. So, for example, you see this peak around 2008. This is the financial crisis. So, and that was essentially reflects the fact that Latin America had, around those decades or those years, institutions that were able to absorb support from the World Bank and multilaterals. No? So, whereas, for example, other regions, Sub-Saharan Africa was less, it was unable to absorb the support available for mitigating the effect of crisis. So also that hints the ability or the possibility of using these policies as counter-cyclical policy measures. But anyway, so I will skip the methodologies because I just have a few. But overall, what we do is an econometric approach that is trying to understand the effect of aid. So we do an instrumental variable. So here are the instruments that I don't want to bother so much about explaining the logic and the rationale. But overall, it's a set of instruments that capture domestic politics in donor countries, but also weighted by range shocks, which also reflect the demand for income support. So, and because range shocks are strictly exogenous, and also it's because reflect also weather conditions, climate shocks. This is a very useful way of approaching this way of instrumenting these questions. And I can go later on if you have interest in, to discuss this. So overall, what we find is aid has played a very important role in supporting these institutions. After controlling for, we have like 6 models with a lot of controls, instrumental variables. We did a very careful analysis about this. And overall, we find strong evidence that they have played a very important role in supporting these institutions to address vulnerabilities and also shocks. There is an important variation across regions. Latin America, for example, show different types of donors playing a more active role in supporting these institutions to emerge, especially, I think, coming from the early years. In sub-Saharan Africa, global institutions or global donors, in particular multilaterals, are the ones that so far, given the data, seems to play a more active role. And this doesn't mean that bilaterals are not contributing. It's simply like the involvement of bilaterals has been so recent in the region. If you think about the history of aid, is from around 2010 and then afterwards when bilaterals became much more active or actively involved in the support of institutions. So there may be some time lag effects. There may be other factors also playing in explaining why bilaterals don't seem to have an effect. And also the confidence intervals, as you can see, these lines are very big. So there is a lot of noise in the estimates about what is going on in Africa. And well, this is an example of what can happen when you support these institutions. And taking the case of Ethiopia, for example, a 1% increase in aid will lead to an increase in about 260,000 persons coming from a baseline of 8.4 million people covered. So, which means that the effect is actually quite significant in terms of the ability of foreign aid to support the expansion of these institutions to support vulnerable populations. So we test several theoretical predictions, and in the paper, I invite you to read the paper, maybe it's easier, but we tested several predictions, and what I just want to go perhaps at the end of them, which is related to this panel, is that certainly shocks have, as expected, a negative effect in the expansion of these systems, and therefore here I think that the role of supporting institutions that can counteract these external factors that underpin the expansion of institutions can be really, really important. So, well, I think that essentially what I want to say is that there are a number of things that can underpin the expansion of these systems and the effectiveness of aid. But overall, I think that the economic dynamism of the aid recipient countries are key. The level of the redistributive fiscal capacity, the level of income inequality, all these are really important factors in considering how, for example, donors can maximize their effect in certain contexts. And the information that provides this study can give you some important insights about how to go around these particular factors, but I leave it there. So thanks.
Okay, we're going to jump online to Michael DANQUAH, hopefully joining us from WIDER. Michael, are you there?
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, David. Do I have to share my slides, or he would put it up for me? I can do it from here. All right, so I have been working on this with my colleagues, David and Osman. David is on the call, so he may join in at a point. So the Gini is a key measure for looking at the quantifiable progress towards reducing inequality, and this is used by many countries as they attempt to report their quantifiable progress towards SDG 10. Yes, of course, the Guinea is a very good measure, but the issue is it may not paint the full picture, the complete picture when it comes to how a country is doing in terms of its performance towards tackling inequality, given its endowments in this case. So there's a kind of a bigger question here, and that is how well is a country performing in terms of tackling inequality. And the whole argument is that a measure, a measure that looks at the performance of a country, and then also that gives us a bit of understanding in terms of the scope, and then also in terms of the country's potential for improvements, may be a very good measure in this regard. So what we do in this paper is that we attempt to measure the performance of a country in reducing inequality, given its endowments. So here it could be economic, it could be the demographic, and then others as well. And then we also attempt to see how a climate can influence this dynamics. How does climate influence the efficiency of these countries as they attempt to do this? So the approach here is a very straightforward approach. We use the frontier approach, and here we've got two main equations, right? So on the right hand side we have, let me see this, how I can do it here. Okay, so on the right hand side, yes, you have your output, which is your Guinea, and then you have a set of inputs, and then you have your level of efficiency, and then there is also some noise as well. Okay, so we've got two main equations there. One, we do not introduce the issue of climate, and then with the other, we do introduce climate in there. Given your set of outputs, which is your Y, one can estimate the optimal frontier, which is your best practice frontier. And then with the use of your inefficiency, which is the UIT, you could also measure that of the shortfall of your actual Y to that of the potential Y that a country can have in this case. And if you take the exponential of that, you would get the effort, or you could get the performance of a country in trying to reduce inequality. And here, so what we do mainly is to measure the scope and that of a country's potential for improvements in reducing inequality. I cannot see it from here. Good, right. All right, thanks. And then, so what we do here is that, yes, for the Y, we use the Gini index, and then for the X, which is the inputs that goes into this, we have GDP per capita, we have the labor force, we have the educational attainment, we have the natural rent, and some other inputs there as well. So we have in here 160 countries from 1990 to 2020. And we use, yes, of course, variants of the stochastic frontier model, and the true random effect is the best fit for that. Because of time, I may not be able to get into this. So let me move straight to what we find over here. What I'll do is I would spend some time and focus on sub-Saharan Africa, given the time we have. So let me start with the global trends here. So here, there you are. Good, thanks. So here, what we do find is that the global trend here in terms of the effort or the performance is going down. That's what we do find, that there's a bit of a slide down. If we look at it in terms of the original disaggregation, sub-Saharan Africa's effort or performance is very low. It's way below 40%. That of Latin America is also quite low, and then of course South Asia is also a bit low over here. And then when we account for a climate, what we find is that I don't have in the confidence interval, but for that of sub-Saharan Africa, and then of course Latin America, and that of South Asia, we see a bit of intensification there, where the efforts do go down. And then if I take sub-Saharan Africa, what happens is almost the same thing. We see a lot of drag here. It's actually waning down in terms of the effort. Although it is low, it's actually going way down. If we account for a climate, yes, of course, climate also drags the effort that countries make in this space. And then what we do is that we try to categorize this and then show some pathways for countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And here we have 6 of them here. So there are a set of countries that have a fairly average effort, and they seems to be on a sustainable path. Whilst there are also a set of countries, yes, they have a fairly average effort, but they are inconsistent, or they are very sluggish. And then there are a set of countries that have a very low effort, but they seem to be catching up. They seem to be doing that well. Whilst there are also a set of countries, yes, they have a very low effort, but they are in a decline, and they're not making effort in terms of reducing inequality. So I'll show this, and then I would end there. So here we can see 3 countries. So Kenya is one of them. So this is a country where the effort is fairly good. It's about 50, and we see some level of sustenance there. So they seem to be on a sustained path, and there is room to do more. And then, yes, of course, Guinea and Nigeria are also part of these sets. And then there are a set of countries that may need a reset. All right, so these are countries, yes, the effort or the performance is fairly average, but they are on a decline, and they would need a reset. Then countries like Mauritius and Cameroon and that of Ethiopia. Yes, of course, Mauritius is dragged down more in terms of what you call it, climate. And then there are also a set of countries fairly low effort, but there's a bit of a catch-up. So they seem to combine their inputs, effectively, and they are on that decline. And you see countries like Cape Verde and that of Gambia on this. And these are countries that will need a lot of support in order to stay on this path. And then, of course, we have a set of countries, and let me say that they are the majority here. More than half of the countries fall into this category. And what happens is that, yes, the effort is poor, so they have a very poor effort, but they're still in a decline. So these are countries like Tanzania, Ghana, South Africa is there as well. The effort overall is very low, and they're still in a decline as well. So these are some of the ways that we do find in what we are doing. So let me end so that I can be on time. Yes, of course, what we do see is that sub-Saharan African countries are not making enough, or they're not doing enough in terms of tackling inequality, given their endowments. Clearly, there is more room. If we look at the potential and we look at where they are, there's a lot of room. There's a lot of improvements that countries can make in this case. And then also climate effects are key. You see that in some of the countries like Kenya, like Mauritius and some other countries. You see that climate actually drags the effort that they do make. And then let me end by the big question, which we can look at, would be, how do we effectively do this? These 3 or 4 sets of countries, those with a fairly average effort, but they are doing well. They seem to be on a sustainable path. Those with a fairly average effort and they are in a decline. Those in a very low effort, but trying to catch up. And then the others with a very low effort and in a decline. How do we effectively help them? What are the policy measures? What is the role of the development cooperation? And Miguel talked about all that. I mean, what's the role of technical assistance and all that in trying to get them on track? Because there is a lot of room given their current endowment, and they could do more. Let me end here because of time. Many thanks for listening to me. Thanks. David.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Let me just mention that Michael, I had the pleasure of working with Michael. He's co-chairing a committee that Murray Lebrant and I are part of the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population on Population Inequality and Climate Change, and nice to hear his work. Okay, so our discussant is Neva MAKGETLA from Trade and Industry Policy Strategies, TIPS, and I'll give you 5 minutes.
Yeah, so I want to say thank you to everybody for a very interesting set of papers. And the only thing I want to try and talk very briefly, because so we have some time for discussion. But I just wanted to say, I think that what's interesting about the papers is that they really demonstrate the importance of political economy when we're looking at policies on climate change. I mean, we like to act as economists as if it's all rational decision-making driven by the numbers, but in fact, and what's best for society. But in very unequal democracies like we have, particularly in South Africa, it's really important who specifically loses and wins and how they perceive those losses and wins, which is particularly an issue with environmental policy because you're often dealing with externalities. So people don't really see the benefits very easily. But you know, in many developing economies like South Africa that are unequal, if you're a genuine democracy, you have an issue where the voters don't have the resources and a minority has the resources, and trying to thread the needle on policy is often interesting, as those of you who've been in government can tell you. But I also think the papers do point to, in that context, a particular methodological problem for our economics, which is that we've been focusing for the past 50 years on statistical analyses of economic trends, often trying to come up with global realities. But it's hard to translate them into policy because that's about systems that shape decision-making, which is why I really liked your flowchart, which is trying to say, how do we think about those methodologies and not just how do we run the numbers? And then finally, I just want to flag, it's really hard to do particularly regressions or other statistical analyses of inequality in Africa because the data are poor. And so for instance, Angola says it's got a Gini coefficient of 0.5, which would be significantly much better than South Africa. And I think that's unlikely. And also globally, we always say we're the worst in the world, but that's also because the petrostates don't publish Gini coefficients. So I think that, you know, just to flag that I think we need to be careful with those data. You know, income inequality data are always poor. They're often even worse than other data. And then one last thing, you know how we got to social grants in South Africa? This is true. In the 90s, they looked at them and said, oh, we should give everybody the same social grants that whites already got, and they didn't cost it, and they didn't analyze it, and they didn't do an impact assessment, they just did it, and now we have one of the largest social grant systems in the world. So I don't know how that fits into.
Let me open it up to questions from the floor. Questions, comments? I have a question for John, actually. To add to the mix, I was fascinated by the sort of lack of progressivity in spending, government spending in Mexico, especially on the transfer side, because I'm very familiar with the famous Progressa / Oportunidades / whatever famous mother of all conditional cash transfers that I think all of us know about. So I think many of us are probably surprised that Mexico actually doesn't look so good on that. I really wasn't aware of that. So maybe you could comment on that. Other comments? Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Eleanor Carey, I'm from the OECD. I had a question for Miguel and also a question for Michael. So Miguel, thank you so much for your presentation, and to all the presenters, are really very interesting. The data that you presented only goes up to 2020. And of course we know that from 2020 onwards, we are likely to have seen kind of an explosion in social protection as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. So just a question as to what you might expect the trends to look like from 2020 up to now, both in relation to the number of people being covered under certain types of programs, but also in relation to the role of foreign assistance within that. And then my question for Michael was really to challenge you to pick up where you left off around this the role for development cooperation and technical assistance, and ask kind of what you think the balance should be between the role of development cooperation, but also other actors in the system, so not just bilateral and multilateral actors, but also country governments themselves, civil society, etc. So how you see that kind of the spread of responsibility for helping countries to move forward. Thanks.
Great, thanks for those questions. Professor Lebrand.
Yes, I'm just going to push a bit on Neva's points about the political economy, because I think it's such a crucial point, and ask the participants to connect a bit more to that. So for example, in the case of Mexico, besides David Lam's point about Progresa, which the country's sort of unwound a little bit, right? It was an example to the world, but somehow it hasn't survived the political economy. And these environmental issues have got twinned to very populist or not implementing, you know, the narrative that we can really change, make growth inclusive through environmental reform just seem to be winning the day, right? And so maybe you can reflect about that, because, you know, obviously starting to tax things to promote environmental gains is sticking your head into a hornet's nest of that political economy milieu. You know, and maybe even Vusi, who knows the South African political economy really well, you know, he's talking about the economic activity, which is hard enough to do well, and you've made a contribution. You know, how do you think that plays into the sort of how we do the carbon, you know, how we build change the energy mix in the country, for example? Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, we just got a few minutes. I'll start with John to talk about the Mexico case.
Sure. Thank you for the questions. Yes, in fact, I think the main change we have seen in Mexico recently is the shift from something I think will be talked about later, using evidence as a foundation for policy, both environmental and social policy, to a more skeptical, worrying attitude in terms of a more relativistic conception of what is evidence, which is free from ideology, and what is not. So that opens a whole new world of not trusting evidence and the generation of evidence and policy based on evidence. No? So in the case of Prospera, in fact, it was dismantled despite a lot of evidence. It was one of the most evaluated programs in the world. Yeah. And the evidence in this case actually had an effect of promoting the program internationally. You know, it became something which was used in many other countries. But it was basically for ideological reasons, it was changed. And basically the main change in Mexico, which explains the drop in progressivity of targeted programs of direct transfers, cash transfers, is a shift from this kind of program like Progresa to universal transfers. Both, the main one is a pension for old age, non-contributive pension for old age, which has increased dramatically, basically from 0.5 point of GDP. Next year it will be 1.3 points of GDP. At the cost of many other things. No, of course, it has had an effect in lowering poverty of that age group of 65 and plus, but poverty in infants has increased. because Progresa was one of the few programs which actually tackled that phase. No? And the other one is the young people are receiving more transfers, but in a universal form. No? And unfortunately, if you do that and don't expand dramatically the funds, of course, you lose efficiency in terms of tackling poverty. And certainly the resources increase, but not enough, no, to compensate that. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. So yes, you're right. So my analysis run to 2020 because that was the most recent data. But I can tell you, for example, about the experience of COVID. So all the countries introduced overall about 2,000 policy responses to mitigate the effect of COVID across the globe. That was in the rise of COVID. By 2021, well, at the end of 21, just about 50% of those responses remain in place. By 2022, less than 20%, and I suspect that the majority have been undue. No? So there are several reasons for that. One is the significant reduction in the fiscal space that most of the countries experience and continue experiencing now. Also, you know, to be honest, it was quite surprising because, for example, in Latin America during the 1990s, we experienced similar, not in the same level, but we experienced a lot of financial shocks. And there were many ingredients around those events that facilitated the expansion of Progresa, for example. No? That was a transition, a political transition also, a very important one. In Latin America, you see similar examples in Argentina, in Chile, in Bolivia, you know, in Mexico, that relate to those political transitions that in a way connects to what Murray was talking about. And this is something that also I want to reflect on this case of Progresa, that if you think about the reasons why Progresa has been undue as well, is because many of these programs are not embedded into the Constitution. They are not entitlements. You know, these are programs that are usually passed by Congress every year, you know, but it was not an entitlement, no? So therefore, if you have an autocratic or a populist regime, like in the case of Mexico today, they have all the political power to simply replace those with a very clientelistic approach to social policy, which is what happens in Mexico, no? So obviously there is an electoral gain from moving from programmatic to electoral oriented policies. And this is very risky in countries like ours, when you have weak or emerging democracies, no? And this is something that very often we economists, we don't discuss, but I think is vital, no? Thanks.
Thanks. So I mentioned, Mary, briefly when I was presenting that although we encourage the just energy transition, so decarbonization is important, but most importantly, the context is also very critical. And there are debates about the pace of, you know, and then the timelines that have been given for decommissioning, as in the context of Mpumalanga decommissioning the coal-fired power stations. And of course, there are major implications for that. And the point I make, and there's some work at least that's starting to take place around this, and I've been asked to get involved with it, is to survey, go to the field, do field work, engage the communities, not like government will engage them, but as researchers, you know, get data, do analysis, and, you know, make recommendations about how best to approach just transition. Because I think we can learn a lot from affected communities. We hear from them, but I think proper studies that involve fieldwork will help us. And I wanted to say, by the way, when you're making the point earlier about the best that economists can do, I think this is what economists should do fieldwork. I think we should do more fieldwork and learn more. Thanks.
Michael, did you have comments? Can we bring Michael back?
Yeah, David, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Yes, so I mean, many thanks for the, you know, comments as well. But so here, when we talk about a performance, it's about how best these countries can combine their, what you call it, their inputs. So here, their endowments are key. And I think that the development cooperation should not ignore their endowment. So these countries have something, right? And so it's about how best they can put them together. So I give you a quick example. If you have a country with a very poor effort, I'm from Ghana, so let me use Ghana as an, what do you call it, example. What they do need is more or less the level of assistance that could help them combine their, what do you call it, their inputs effectively. It may not be, it may not be something else, but something that would help them get the best of what they have. And so these are some of the things. And so, yes, great, but let's take note of the countries and endowment. Let's look at their potential and how best we can help them get there. That could be key. But if you find a country that has a fairly high effort, then yes, what it may need may not be the same as the other country that has such levels of poor effort. I hope I'm.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And thanks for joining us virtually. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to Neva. Thanks for the questions.